And today we've got a great panel for you on solving for the future of mobility, where we'll be looking at the current state of smart cities integration, and then we'll be looking at what's to come in the future. And here with me today are some stakeholders from across the smart city and mobility spectrum. And we're going to be discussing some of the trends, benefits, and challenges within smart cities integration before moving on to some audience Q&A. But before we get started, I'd like to just have each of the panelists briefly introduce themselves. So let's kick things off with you, Scott.
Okay. Hi, I'm Scott Drennan. I'm the VP of Innovation here at Bell. We're responsible for the Nexus vehicle that you see out front, as well as our new operating system for connected mobility called AirOS. Welcome to the booth, and thanks for participating in the panel with us.
Good afternoon. I'm Scott Corwin. I lead Deloitte's Global Future Mobility practice.
I'm Seleta Reynolds. I run the Department of Transportation for the City of Los Angeles. I'm also the chair of the Open Mobility Foundation.
My name is Prakriya. I work in Azure at Microsoft. We are actually members of the Open Mobility Foundation and really excited to partner with Bell on all of their smart city endeavors. I run the Microsoft Connected Vehicle platform as well as Azure Maps, so it's Azure IoT Mobility.
Great. My name is Ben Marcus. I'm the co-founder of AirMap. We're the leading airspace management platform for high-scale flight operations. And thanks very much for the invitation.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you to the Bell team for having us. My name is Nabil Malouli. I work for DHL, and I'm the Vice President of Global E-commerce. I'm in charge of all the product development and strategy for all our e-commerce clients.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And to get started, you know, the term smart city is kind of a big buzzword this year at CES. But I'd like to drill down a little bit and just figure out, you know, what exactly does that mean? So this is kind of a two-part question, and I think we'll start with you, Seleta. You know, what does the term smart city mean to you, and what are the benefits that it can provide for the citizens of a city?
Sure. You know, smart city is one of these words. It's been around for a while, and has such broad use and application that it's almost become meaningless. It's a word like sustainability or walkability or urbanism, and when I say it, every single one of you probably has a different idea of what it means. So at LADOT, the way we think about a smart city is really, it boils down to outcomes. It's about nobody dying in traffic crashes. It's about people being able to have access to opportunity and wealth no matter where they live, no matter what zip code they were born in. And it's about people being able to enjoy all of the things that we love about cities. The opportunities they provide to people, the joy of community and well-being, the social connectivity that people have in cities. So for us, that's what a smart city delivers. And we're sort of neutral on what the technology is that will get us there, but we are in desperate need of technology to get us there.
Sure. And then, you know, from a mobility provider perspective, Scott, maybe you can speak on that. You know, what does smart city mean to you, and what benefits can smart cities provide to mobility providers and to citizens?
Sure. Well, if you know Bell legacy product, you know that we can land in almost any city, no matter what the infrastructure is. I mean, it has to be set up right for a helicopter. The regulations have to be set up right. But this new smart city idea for me is when we talk about a system of technologies that is the vehicle, the physical infrastructure, and the digital infrastructure all tied together in a way that make for seamless mobility to make the lives of the citizens of the cities, like Seleta was just talking about, better. So Nexus can transport people or goods. Our apt autonomous pod transport likes to do goods as well, and also data. But we have to have a space that the vehicles can not only just talk to each other, but they can talk to the city itself through the digital infrastructure and safely and efficiently operate.
Sure. You know, so to create a valuable experience for growing urban populations, what key services and capabilities do you think smart cities should need to offer? And I can direct this to anybody who's got
maybe I can just answer from a third dimension context.
Yeah.
We want aviation to be a part of daily life for everybody around the world. We want it to benefit citizens in cities. We want them to be able to skip traffic, spend more time with their families, be more productive, emit fewer carbon emissions, and so forth. But the way that air traffic is managed today does not allow for that kind of scale. Believe it or not, the way aircraft avoid collisions between one another is pilots seeing and avoiding other airplanes and helicopters. And that doesn't scale to hundreds of thousands of flights a day over Los Angeles, for example, which would actually address the demand. So in order for this to actually become reality, we need to have new digital infrastructure, not only in the form of platforms that offer services, but also connectivity. All of these aircraft need to be able to be connected digitally, and the existing infrastructure doesn't support that. So we believe that it is a city's role to assure that those enabling connectivity and information exchange platforms are in place, and then allow for the providers of vehicles and the operators of those vehicles to compete to deliver the most valuable services to the citizens.
Great.
Yeah, I think another way to just expand on what you said is there's a need for a digital feedback loop among all the different pieces that are needing to play together, whether it's the commerce providers who are commissioning some of these flights or the passengers who are looking for mobility. But you're going to need a canvas with which to have that digital feedback loop. And so thinking about a common way for all these different pieces to talk together, to interact, that becomes, I think, a really important piece of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm. So I think where we're at, we're really at an interesting moment in time, which is we've had this incredible sort of supply-side innovation. And it's in the area where we have all this globalization and population growth. And the challenge now is cities are confined spaces. So and we've tended to optimize transportation as single modes with old governance structures. And part of where we're headed now with this idea of seamless intermodal is how do you connect these pieces? You can go from point A to point B using different modes, and they magically integrate and stitch together. That's what this digital backbone idea is all about. But it also requires governance. It requires how are we going to actually introduce these new technologies? How do we not have incredible disruption into our daily lives? Because when you go back to what is a city, to me, I've lived in New York for 40 years, and I am an urbanist. And what I love about the city is it's actually a bunch of neighborhoods and communities, and you walk, and it isn't really about the technology. The technology enables a better quality of life, but it's not at the expense of essentially technology's the end. The end is actually, greater prosperity, greater quality of life, greater inclusivity, greater accessibility. That, to me, is ultimately what a smart city will be about.
And I just want to chime in and say, we live in a competitive, capitalist, representative democracy, right? And so whenever we want to do something in the U.S. That is sort of consistent across all different kinds of modes, we don't have the kind of singular top-down control form of government that exists in other parts of the world. And so for us, when as a country we've been able to achieve that, it is only when we have deep partnerships between public, private, nonprofit, academic, and when Scott talks about sort of new forms of government and governance, I think this is one of the keys to smart cities and achieving these outcomes is we really do have to all get out of our traditional lanes and our comfort zones in the way that we've been working together up until now, or we won't get there.
But that sounds like we're trying to get a kumbaya moment, and the hard reality is there are going to be winners and losers.
Yep.
And that's a really hard thing, and particularly for legacy incumbents. And by the way, the public transit agencies don't get a pass either. They actually have to deliver mobility that meets the needs of the citizens, that's affordable and convenient. And if they can't, and the private sector doesn't, well, guess what? We're going to have to figure out how to depreciate those assets. And we're going to have a whole sort of transition over the next 10, 20 years. So all these new technologies are coming. They're great. but there's a displacement effect associated with them. And that's the market at play.
Sure. So, kind of on that note, some of the topics that we've touched on here already. What are the challenges that are currently standing in the way of smart cities implementation, particularly with its integration with mobility?
Yeah, I could start. When we think about the challenges, I think there are two main ones. One is the orchestration. For us, when we look at what is a smart city, we're really talking about orchestration powered by technology. So orchestration, because at the end, the city is an ecosystem of different stakeholders and different organizations and entities that have to coexist on the best way possible. So when you think about what is the main challenge, probably the main challenge is who is responsible of orchestrating that entire ecosystem. And that means who's going to invest, who's going to manage it. And the reality is today, there are only few companies that have the power to do that, and they are private companies. So that's a bit of the challenge with governments. I don't think they are equipped to start really the process. So you have to think about how do we do with all these privacy problems and all the challenges around some of the big names in the tech world. How do we bring that to work really with governments to be able to empower this? I think that's one thing. The second thing I think that is a main challenge is profitability. I mean, we talk a lot about mobility and we talk a lot about ride sharing and a lot of the new technologies, e-scooters, you name it. Problem is many of the organizations are losing a lot of money. And many people are still thinking that, yes, it could be profitable, but it's probably going to take another 10, 20 years. So which companies are willing to go and invest into that extent? So I think the topic of money and who's going to invest and who's going to pool the funds, if you think about how many cities have an innovation fund? Probably very few. How many cities have actually a digital strategy? Probably very few. So I think it's that coexistence between orchestration and how do you make it work financially that needs to be the real point of discussions.
So I'm not sure. Absolutely, there are going to be incumbents that will have to change fairly dramatically. But I guess I don't quite paint it as the winners and the losers. There's going to be two sides of the coin that'll need to be figured out. One of them will be on trust. So when you think about those partnerships, I think it's important to have alignment on business model, on trust, on where is that consumer data going and who's really going to benefit from that. Our citizens are people, and their privacy needs should absolutely be considered. So I think thinking about trust is very important. But thinking about regulation is important too. That's a lever. It's a lever that I don't think we know how to use completely yet. So some of the innovation isn't going to be just technology innovation, but also regulation innovation in terms of what does it take to participate in a smart city and what's the table stakes that everyone really needs to pony up to in order to be a part of it.
Yeah, and I would disagree with the point that you made about government not being capable or able to sort of step up to that challenge. Because, no, I don't have an innovation fund in the city of Los Angeles, but I have $120 billion that I'm going to invest in mobility over the next 40 years. And getting from A to B, the trip itself is rarely where you can make money. And that's why public transit has to sort of remain one of those things that the public sector delivers, because the return on the investment is indirect. It's the job opportunity that people can get and then improve their economic status and then go reinvest that back into the local economy. And so I think the challenge is government has to expand our definition of where we are investing those public transit dollars and how we think about the different forms of mobility that serve a city, so that we can be co-investors with the private sector and help alleviate some of those concerns about profitability, but at the same time have a true level partnership to talk about the outcomes that we're trying to deliver. And I think it's those kind of paradigm shifts that are some of the key barriers to smart city, sort of to realizing that. Between GDPR and California's consumer privacy law, there are a lot of businesses that were hoping to build their business models and profitability around monetizing data, and now a lot of that is just off the table. So regulation becomes this really important conversation that I think will play out in the next year, where sort of private companies were able to move through a somewhat unregulated space, particularly in technology, and now that's starting to swing back in the opposite direction, maybe without this kind of nuanced conversation about, are we really solving the right problem and getting outcomes that we want?
One of the things I find interesting about the back and forth that we're having, I love a rich panel like this, is there's a common thread that innovation is required. We think innovation is always associated to the tech, and it is, and innovation takes capability and courage, but now we're talking about regulatory innovation, business modeling innovation, relationship innovation between you and your fellow citizens. And I think that's really exciting to think about all the different areas that we can use innovation tools to really make this happen.
Absolutely.
Maybe I'll just touch on one thing that both of you were talking about, which is innovation around governance. And I think there's a couple of exciting points of light that we can cite that have happened recently. One is through Seleta's leadership, the creation of the Open Mobility Foundation, which has brought together some fantastic partners and open-sourced the mobility data specification. And another is in the third dimension, there is a new open source protocol for the exchange of identity and location information for drones, which is now managed by the Linux Foundation. So I think by putting these things into the public domain, allowing them to have the natural governance that comes from being observed by the community, it's really healthy, and I think sort of offloading some of the responsibility that government specifically had previously.
And I think the point you make on open standards is really important. I mean, Microsoft is a member of the Open Mobility Foundation because we believe strongly in that, and that's not always the same thing as open source, which means there are opportunities for business innovation to power some of the innovations that we'd like to see, where there is a way to make the right profitability without necessarily compromising the privacy, and yet having the open standards so all these systems of systems can actually talk to each other.
Yep.
Great. So speaking of data and privacy, obviously for these smart cities to succeed, the citizens will need to be okay with contributing their data into the greater ecosystem. So, how can we build their trust in the security of smart cities?
Well, I think, let me start. I think if we can see significant improvements as consumers or as people, I think we'll be fine with that. I mean, already people are giving their information just to have access to Facebook. So if you can save a lot of time, you'll probably be okay to share your information. And, depending on who is depending on who is the entity that is managing that information. But I think generally speaking, I'm a foreigner. Every time I come to the US, it's a nightmare. I come now through global entry. It's facial recognition. I go from 1 hour to 1 hour and a half customs line to 5 seconds. They can have all my information, medical information. I give them everything they want for that time. So I think if we can see significant improvement and that the entity has the backing, I think people will be fine, generally speaking.
I think that's important. I don't think that's enough. Certainly, if you cannot make the user experience more convenient, there's no reason for someone to share their data. But that isn't enough. It is important to understand how that data is going to be used, by whom, under what circumstances. Can you change your mind later? Can you opt out at that point? These are really important questions. And I think if we cannot transparently answer them, no one should give their data to the systems that are involved. It should be very transparent, and it should be very clear.
Yeah, data, it feels like there's a huge data literacy gap that we have to solve before we can even have that kind of conversation, because people may feel like on the surface, it's fine for me to give information away because I'm getting something in a transactional moment, but I don't know that that data is now being used to create a social score for me that might influence how long I sit on hold when I call, customer service. Those kinds of things are not really, they haven't been unearthed yet. And I think that's really the first step before we can talk about trust.
But I think it's very easy. It's achievable.
It's a solvable problem.
And it's one that I think we have to work together on, especially as the boundaries of how that data needs to be used won't be limited to one system. So we're going to have to invent ways of getting consent that allow for data to move from system to system where there's transparency all the way throughout. These are exciting problems to solve.
Yeah, I think the awareness of what you're doing with your data and where it's going is great. I also would like to add the cyber security piece. So once you form that trust, let's make sure it's then protected past that so that there's not a new eventuality that opens up or that you didn't expect. And it's an interesting journey for us in that respect. We're used to cyber conversations from our military customers, but now that's really having to take the front of the line with the civilian applications, especially when they're autonomous and then especially when they're connected for reasons that seem obvious, but obviously we don't want anyone interjecting their desire on the vehicle flight path or anything else. And then the data that has to exchange hands is just as important for safety and privacy and efficiency of the system.
Wonderful. So, what are some of the critical milestones within the implementation of smart cities and mobility?
Well, I can start that one off a little bit. I was mentioning today on an earlier panel that a lot of times people see a vehicle like that and they think, well, everything about the autonomy and everything about the interconnected communication is all on the vehicle. And if I had a big gas turbine and a big rotor and it kind of looked like a helicopter, I might have some extra payload and power and space for that. But in a vehicle like this that's all about unlocking all electric performance, we need to be more careful about that. So I think there is a really neat combination of, say, let's use navigation as a starting point, that's on the vehicle, but also that's in the city. So a part of the city's infrastructure and a part of the digital infrastructure that connects those two vehicles. You could think about ground-based radar making autonomous flight a lot safer for vehicles like this in a busier traffic zone. You could think about the communications piece. We talked often about 5G being a part of the communication solution for these vehicles. It probably is not going to be the safety of flight communications path, but it can certainly supplement the need for exchanging data. In fact, we're doing an experiment next year with our autonomous logistics vehicle. As we fly through DFW, we're going to use the LTE network and test out how some of that data exchange takes place.
Fantastic.
For us, the smart city milestones are really not any different than the milestones that we're aiming for today, right now. Closing the wealth gap between Black families and other families in Los Angeles, cutting the number of people who die on our streets every year down to zero, making sure that half the trips that happen in the city are not happening in a single occupant vehicle. These are our milestones, and they don't change depending on if we're talking about a smart city or just talking about mobility and what we're trying to deliver.
Sure.
Can I
just
just make a comment?
sorry.
I think it's extremely important to talk about cities. We oftentimes talk about the cities in the US, but the reality is there are common threads and there are common themes, but there are also a lot of topics which are really specific to one area or another. And I think when we think about that, it's really important to engage the citizens and get that input as to what are the main challenges, aside of poverty, security, and some of the things that are probably across 99% of the cities, to be able to really look at that and then look at what are the technologies that could be helping to alleviate some of these problems. Not the other way around. We oftentimes come with technology and then we try to figure out what do we do with that, when I think it should be really always the other way around.
Sure. So speaking of cities and different regions and that kind of thing, do we think that mobility as a service is only going to be something that's offered within large cities like Los Angeles, or do you think smaller scale cities are going to adapt to this as well?
So the interesting thing about mobility as a service is that today, when you look at all those different apps that are out there, they're tending to optimize you as a single individual and how you get from point A to point B. And the challenge now is when everyone optimizes their own pathway? What happens to the overall system? How do we actually optimize all of these different forms of mobility? Who gets to make the choices of how to do that? Does government tell you you can go this way? Do we offer up other alternatives? Do we begin to price for use of the infrastructure? How do we create the connection of all the systems that need to exist? Deal with data privacy? So, I mean, I think it's possible, but it's going to take this kind of systems thinking and bringing all these stakeholders together, which is not an easy thing to do, and probably, arguably, has never been done short of a major crisis where you can mobilize these people. On the other side of this, if we get this right, it's incredible what can happen in terms of the benefits it provides.
I do think that there are chances for big improvements and changes in non-urban areas around mobility, no question. But I do think that it's a different problem set and a different solution set. So for example, a lot of the severe and fatal injuries that happen in rural areas, they're severe injuries that turn into fatalities because trauma centers have moved and because it takes longer to get people to urgent medical care. So there is a mobility solution to that, and I'm sure Scott has plenty of ideas about how Bell could help close that gap, but that is really different than trying to solve for what Scott Corwin is talking about, which is this tragedy of the commons, where we have everybody optimizing individual efficiency, and there are massive failures on the collective good across multiple areas, economics, public health, everything that we see in cities. That's a totally different kind of solution set when it comes to something like whatever you call it, mobility as a service or seamless integrated mobility or just door-to-door transportation that you don't have to think about.
Well, the other side of this is goods and assets and logistics. And I think there's a little bit more representation across not just urban mobility, but trying to get from one urban center to the other that naturally covers a whole swath of areas altogether. So certainly urban mobility, that's 85% of the world's GDP happens in major cities. So it's an area that needs to be addressed, but there's a lot more to transportation and the needs that are there than just moving the people around. I mean, goods and services are moving to people at a very fast rate with any number of delivery services or other pieces that are out there. The tragedy of the commons, though, the way that you phrase that is really interesting. I've used a phrase of, instead of just systems optimized for me, that we need to get to systems optimized for we. It'll be interesting to think about how we can even come up with what are the standards that we can use for maybe the barter systems that need to exist in terms of allowing sometimes being a little bit further back in the line for that time you really do need to get somewhere quickly. In some ways, these are like tolls today. I think they'll have to go through an innovation as we go through. So some of the same concepts might last as we go through this revolution. We just have to be a lot more adaptable about it, a little bit more real time, and allow for dynamic changing in order to really have things flow.
And I think that a lot of the new technologies we're talking about can really solve jobs to be done for people who live in these rural areas. So, 15% of the global economy is from rural areas. I think that we would be a lot better off as a global human race if the rural areas contributed a lot more to the economy. And why is it that they're left behind? It's because they don't have a low latency link to the rest of the world, a physical link, right? And so if I'm living in a village in maybe not the United States, but maybe somewhere in Africa or Southeast Asia, and I am producing some good that I want to be able to sell. Right now, I can really only sell that in my own local area. But what if I was connected to a global marketplace? I could sell my goods everywhere, increase my own prosperity and the prosperity of my village, but also the whole world. And I think that helicopters have been able to connect people for a long time, but they've been expensive. And now we're bringing the cost way down, bringing the autonomy in, reducing the need for skilled pilots, and able to make aviation more useful for everybody all around the world.
Sure.
Yeah,
So, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Those are just great points. It makes me think about a couple things. First, I'll answer your question directly. We see it as intra-urban, interurban, suburban, and rural. We have customers in all of those sets that are coming to us both for people moving solutions. That's one of the reasons we have an agnostic propulsion system, a vehicle that can be hybrid or electric. So if we need to just do an intracity mission, we're there with the all-electric. If we need to go city to city, we'll extend the range with the hybrid. And then it looks like the suburban and rural communities really want to be served by the unmanned logistics systems as well. There's a lot of inefficiency when you think about someone delivering packages out to places that are 40 miles away and then 40 miles away again, and we could maybe send out the apps to take care of that. The other thing that's amazing about this conversation is the subtlety at which, I look at these folks as stakeholders in all this, but then I also like to look at them as customers. And when I hear them talk about the subtleties of what mobility means to them, I get excited because it reminds me of the days when the Bell company was creating powered lift. This notion that you could have a vehicle that was a helicopter and an airplane at the same time. At that time, we knew as engineers that twice as far, twice as fast had to be better, but we had no idea what kind of creative use cases our customers would come up with. So when I hear discussions like this, I'm trying to soak them all in, but there's this urge inside of me to just make the best technology that's transformational so that the customers who need it can use it to their own good, which is really neat.
One of the questions you haven't asked is about adoption and how quickly it will happen. And I do think that the point that was made about the movement of goods is likely to be where autonomy in particular is going to have its early successes. Because you take the human factor out and you're able to sort of contain it. And then you think about the use cases in terms of unmanned aircraft and the delivery of medical supplies in places like Rwanda, where it's life and death, and there is no elasticity curve on the value of what we're creating, right? And that's where we're going to see a lot of those use cases, and people are going to get more used to it, and then eventually they'll get more comfortable in terms of the movement of people. And I think the same thing will be true with with AVs and cars, particularly in more crowded urban environments.
So speaking of the vehicles, obviously, there's a giant one right here. There's a few others on the show floor. Do we think that smart cities are going to be implemented before these vehicles are flying?
I hope so, because we need a place to land, and we're not kidding about how smart cities being the way we need to do this. So if Nexus was flying today, could I land on a heliport in LA right now? Yes, we could. But that's not the solution that we need for the smart cities that we're talking about today.
Right, because most of those helipads on top of those buildings in Los Angeles exist on top of structures full of people, that are either living or working there. And so it's the same challenge we have with high-capacity transit stations, subway and light rail stations. You can get to this point, but how do you get the rest of the way on your journey? And have we actually just created a new choke point and a new pain point without solving for that true door-to-door kind of solution? And I think that the point that we keep kind of teasing out about goods movement is really critical. I think that goods movement has transformed the way people use mobility infrastructure in cities in ways that we are almost totally blind to. There is no comprehensive data set for the number of trips being generated by urban goods movement in a city like Los Angeles or New York. That information is all very tribal. It's all held by those individual companies who are all optimizing for what they're trying to do. And while it's tempting to sort of think, well, automation then can solve that, I think we also have to be mindful of the fact that There are really very strong coalitions of organized labor who currently have jobs driving and delivering those goods. At the Port of Los Angeles last year, we had a proposal from a major shipper to automate part of the container movement on the port property that was going to be very powerful in terms of both saving money for the city and for that company and delivering goods in a more efficient and safer way. And that proposal failed because of the organized labor being concerned about being automated out of their jobs. So we're talking now about the largest port on the west coast of the United States choosing to be less profitable instead of automating part of their operations. This is a really critical part of a barrier to smart city implementation, a really important conversation that we have to have. When I asked LADOT employees what they thought about the fact that their general manager is sitting on panels and talking about flying cars, the number one word that came back in that survey was fear, because they are all afraid about what it will mean for their jobs, their quality of life, their families, and their future. So I think these are multi-layered conversations, and that's why it's so great to have a group of people like this who can all tease out and make sure that those subtleties aren't missed.
I want to pick up on that point. I had the great privilege earlier this year to go to a summit at the Vatican. And it was sponsored by the Pope and the Pontifical Academy of Science, but it was also really sponsored by the International Transport Federation, which are all the employees of the public transit unions globally. It's a couple 100 million people. And the stories that they shared, it gave you a deep appreciation. This isn't a set of Luddites that are against technological progress, but in fact, what they're arguing is that they add tremendous value in terms of safety, for example. The amount of human trafficking that goes through transportation facilities is prevented when it's prevented through the fact that there's organized labor visibly there. We talk about safety in transportation. There was a company that is a bus transport company that does shuttle buses, that does paratransit, and they showed a video of an autonomous van in a suburban park at night with a woman sitting on a bench that they would come and get her with a microphone available sort of response. And I looked at that and said, I wouldn't want to sit there in the dark, right? And think that somehow magically someone's going to come if there's a problem, right? So I think there is a really important role. And the real question is, how do we engage organized labor to join on in terms of this transformation? So I'll give you another example, which is autonomous drive trucking, long-haul trucking. Today we have a shortfall of 1 million certified licensed drivers in the United States. It is a job that is extremely hazardous, very dangerous. You're away from home for long periods of time. It's a pretty tough job, and the risks are quite inherent. And guess what? Most of the drivers today are baby boomers. Millennials don't want to become long-haul truck drivers. And meanwhile, the exponential rise of e-commerce, we need to figure out how to deliver more goods. So automation, even if it's partial autonomy, could really help, because today those truck drivers do shifts of 7 and 8 hours, and they have mandated rest, and they can only do so many back-to-back. And if you used the technology, we could enable back-to-back shifts, and it could be a win-win for, in fact, the truck drivers that exist today, because the productivity savings could be passed along. So we have to find creative solutions, and then we ultimately have to provide education opportunities for people to get employed and where the future is going.
Yeah. I've got another great example for you, if I may. Our partner's Yamato, and this is just that same point about you really don't know how that use case is going to pan out until you get there with the customer and speak intimately with them. So they were explaining to us, as I'm looking at their logistics network, I'm thinking, well, you got this. you might not need us. And wherever my BD guys are, don't shoot me for this. But then we started to ask them more questions about it, and they said, actually, we value one of our people with our Yamato hat looking our customer in the eye and handing over the package. So how can your system help us do that more? And so these are so labor and the case of generational differences, and then even private companies that have a value system that can be helped by efficient mobility all have to be considered inside of the questions.
Great.
Yeah, if I may just, because I think we are...
Okay, briefly, and then let's move on to audience Q&A.
Oh.
It was not going to be a brief comment, but I will try to make it brief. No, I think just on the goods transportation side, I think it's an extremely important topic as well, and I agree with all the comments that were made here. I think one of the biggest things that's going to really exponentially increase the complexities in cities is e-commerce, and I think, Scott, you just talked about this. But if you look at the stats, and even though e-commerce exists for 30 years, the real exponential growth starts 2012. That's when you see explosions of volume. And we are just at the beginning, because even if you look at penetration rate, even in the US, we're talking about 17%, wow. 17. And in groceries, it's at 2 to 3%. So imagine in probably 5 years, the amount of trucks and vehicles that are going to do urban deliveries, when these percentages goes to retail maybe 50%, which is not an impossible number, as we are seeing actually growth every year. And groceries, that's going to be an extremely more complex topic, because groceries is even less efficient in terms of delivery system, because you have to do it fast and you have to do it, in very short distances, going back and forth to small distances. So when you think about that, this is a major topic for any city, and it needs to be really looked at. What are the technologies that you can really implement? I think that's one key point. The other thing around, like the example of the port and the example of some of the technologies that have a hard time to be accepted. Today, we live in a really global world, especially when it comes to technology. If you look at delivery robots, one of the most advanced countries in the world is Lithuania. Why? Because they have an extremely powerful startup in Lithuania that is doing delivery with robots. And so the governments, and they have a very strong backing, and then they are helping that company to grow, but that company is very present in the US now, and they've done already 100,000 deliveries. They are further away from any other company in that space. So when you look at that, you can try to, to hold a little bit, but reality is, if you become less efficient and less productive and more expensive, it's not going to take another 20 years now. It's going to take probably 5 years. If LA becomes an extremely expensive port to be passing through compared to another, well, port is different because it's a very heavy capital expenditure. It's not a good example, but if you look at other businesses that can be replaced without huge amount of money and huge amount of government approval, you can be really, really quickly out of the game. And I think you have to keep this in perspective.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your perspectives.